Welcome back. We are at SPARCS 18, and this is the closing panel. And we are very excited to be joined by our panelists and our speakers from this year's conference. To my far right, we have Dr. Chris Izari. He's the Director of Applied Genomics Center at the College of Veterinary Medicine at Western University of Health Sciences. To his left is Dr. Jessica Heckman. She's a postdoctoral associate at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. To my left is Dr. Kelly Ballantyne. She's a board-certified veterinary behaviorist and is a clinical assistant professor at the University of Illinois College of Veterinary Medicine. And to her left is Dr. Eleanor Carlson. She's an assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts Medical School and the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. And I'm Julie Hecht, and this is Mia Cobb, and we've been your science hosts for SPARCS 18. And we're pretty excited to be coming back for this final panel to just tie it all together.
Really, really grateful for all the great comments and questions and ideas that have been coming through on the Twitter. Not to mention
the puppy dogs.
All of our beautiful viewers' animals. You'll see we've had ferret, we've had cats, we've had dogs.
Sleeping cats.
Yeah,
Sleeping cats.
Lots of cats that are not at all excited by the content that's
ferret
going
is
on.
so into it.
Yeah. The ferret has been very active.
No, a ferret, really?
Yeah, truly. Yeah. So we have got some great questions to get into here. Some are fairly specific, and we might start with those because we'll probably find that they're a little bit easier to address, and then we're going to dive into some chunkier, crunchier, harder to answer topics and questions that we can all really get input into. But more specifically, I guess, relating to today's speakers, so to Kelly and Jessica to start with, someone commented that there'd been a recent study in mice that suggested evidence of heritability of memories. For example, offspring could do a task with less learning if the parents had learned the same task prior to reproduction, and wanting to know whether there'd been any research of this in dogs with regard to inherited behaviours.
Not to my knowledge.
Not to mine either. I haven't read that particular mouse study. There was a mouse study a few years back where they showed that if the fathers were exposed to a particular smell, they were trained to fear it, that was passed on in some ways to the offspring. It was such an interesting study because it detailed, like they even saw the wiring in the brain that had changed, and so it was a really, really detailed and well-explained study, and yet everybody's still like, what is the mechanism?
Yeah. How does that happen?
And I haven't seen other studies since then that have done similar things, and so I think we're still at the stage where we're sort of like, it seems like possibly parents can learn things and pass it on to their offspring, and that's very surprising. And we don't know how it works, and we'd all really like to know if it really happens or how it works, or so.
But on the flip side of that, we do know about social learning between dogs and other dogs, and also now dogs and humans that Adam McCloskey mentioned earlier.
So we know that the training time, for example, in a working dog program can be shorter if a young dog's allowed to watch an experienced dog before the same task, before they're then asked to do it. Cool.
Okay. Great. Both
All
ends.
right. This question perhaps we can get input from everybody on. And it's one that I guess is more of an observation, perhaps, and then I'd like your input on the observation. But I guess how else can we as researchers, and I guess anyone else who's watching as well, what else can we be doing to help inform the general public? So we see situations that we've discussed today, like breed-specific legislation come into play, and perhaps a dog, in my hometown of Melbourne, we had BSL introduced, and pit bull type dogs were, impacted, and we saw perhaps some of those dogs, the population levels reduce, but then we saw that there were still, other dogs taking the place of those in the media coverage and being demonised. So in place of perhaps the pit bull types, perhaps we had the Rottweilers coming in and being targeted as being, demonised as being the bad dogs. So what else can we do to kind of break that cycle so it doesn't just become a shifting target, both in, cultural perception, but also media coverage? How else can we be doing more to break that cycle so that we aren't trying to target some kind of dog, given what we've learned over the last few days about the irrelevance of that?
Well, part of me is hoping that this particular conference can be a starting point to that. So just getting that information out to a broader audience and really driving home the message that dogs are individuals and that that type of legislation is ineffective and it's not a good model for solving that problem. So that's one of my hopes, and I think we just need to keep spreading that message out there because I think, unfortunately, the veterinary behaviorists and other people who work with dog behavior a lot really understand that dogs are individuals, but obviously the general public has their own assumptions. Even Jessica and I were talking at the break about a scientist that we both really respect, and I was reading his book and I really enjoyed his book, and then he made a statement about 2 different dog breeds and how that is very clearly about behavioral genetics, and I was like, ooh, that is not what's going on there. So yeah, I think it's about spreading the message through forums like these.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add that one of the things I really enjoyed this weekend was that everybody's work actually ended up focusing on this idea that each dog is an individual. And at least as far as I'm concerned, I didn't actually plan that with anybody ahead of time. It just is actually what everybody is seeing independently. And I think as much as possible, getting that idea out there that it's not about breed, it's about the dog. So you don't just switch from, pit bull being bad to Rottweiler being bad, because that's still worrying about the breed, and you need to think about the individual dog. And then I think especially for anybody working professionally in the field, to find every time you have that moment where you say, because they're an X something, or obviously this difference is because of the breed, just kind of stop and think a little bit more about it.
Yeah, no more labels.
Yeah, exactly. And just say,
assumptions.
is this actually what I want to say? Do I actually know this? Do I want to make sure that I caveat this in some way to make sure I'm clearer about what it is I'm trying to say? Because it's kind of like an extension of this instinct that everybody has when they see a mutt to say what breed is in it. It's so built into the way we think about dogs. And I think that the people that are kind of talking about it also fall into this. And if we can just consciously try to move away from it a little bit, that will help the message that everybody else is getting as well.
One thing that I've noticed when I try and talk to people is sometimes I hear sentences like, well, okay, isn't it worth it if we just got rid of all of this breed, whatever the issue is? Because even if that just saves one life, isn't it worth it? And that's like a challenging point to discuss or rebut. But I think if we focus on what dogs really are to us, which is our friends and our companions, and we focus on the human-animal bond, what we're really saying is it okay if we just strip 17 or 25,000 families in our city of their best friends so that we may or may not save somebody? I think we need to also put value on the human-animal bond, so it's not like dogs are worth nothing, and so if we get rid of all these things worth nothing and we save one life, look at the good we've done. We have to look at the consequences of making that decision in terms of psychology and the impact on our children and our families.
No,
No.
I think everyone else has said
Yeah.
exactly.
This is wonderful. Well, one other area and term that people very often use is this term aggression, where aggression, for anybody viewing it out here, might have a definition that they think is aggression, but a geneticist might have a definition of aggression. A vet behaviorist or a certified applied animal behaviorist might split aggression into lots of different categories. So when we're talking about these expressions of behaviors or categories of behaviors, how do we even talk about defining it? And how do you, maybe in your field, try and define it, or have a hard time when you're reading somebody from another field or speaking with a member of the general public specifically around this topic of aggression?
So I'm going to speak as the person that doesn't know anything about behavior.
Excellent.
So personally, the term aggression has confused me terribly because I don't know what it means, and everybody seems to have a different understanding of it, and there's all this emotional weight. And I remember last year I was at a talk that was talking about rats, where they did something similar to what they did with the foxes, where you had rats that they tried to breed for friendly rats versus what they called aggressive rats. And they had a video of the aggressive rats, and the rat was in an enclosure, and they stuck the hand in or whatever it was, and the rat attacked it, and they're like, look at this aggressive rat. And it was totally obvious to me that if the rat hadn't been in a box that it would have run away. And I was like, isn't the rat just scared? Why is that aggression? And so since then, I've just kind of taken the coward's way out, and I just try to avoid using the word aggression at all, because everybody seems to have all of this emotional weight to it, and I'm not entirely sure exactly what it's supposed to mean.
Well, and I guess I would follow that up by saying, these terms they're constructs, so they do mean different things to different people. And coming from a medical model, we even look at our diagnoses. They're constructs, but when I'm talking to another veterinarian and I talk about something such as hyperadrenocorticism, and I could say to Jessica, hey, Jessica, this dog has hyperadrenocorticism, she knows exactly what's going on, and it clarifies our communication because we come from that same perspective. And so as a veterinary behaviorist, I still do give animals diagnoses, even though I do understand that that's a construct, that I've made a definition about that term, or I have a certain idea about what that term means. And it is tricky because those terms can be misunderstood. I think, however, that those types of diagnostic constructs still have value, because if we want to study a specific condition or a set of conditions, we need to be able to put them into categories so that we can start to identify, are there differences or similarities between those
So
categories.
is it about being careful to provide a definition when
Absolutely.
you do use
Yes,
constructs?
yes,
Yeah.
and the definition part is also really tricky, and you could ask 5 different veterinary behaviorists, what kind of diagnostic terms they use, and you're probably going to get 5 different definitions still at this point, because we're not really great at clarifying our definitions. But that's something that we're working on, because it is really important that we have, clear phenotypes when we're talking about certain things.
For the general public, could you give a little example of maybe how you split out that term aggression?
Oh, yes. So, in my practice, the way that I split out aggression is in terms of what I'm perceiving to be the animal's motivational or emotional state. So I might say things like fear-related aggression or territorial aggression or conflict-related aggression. And to me, all of those terms mean different things. And other veterinarians who've had the same kind of training will understand what I mean when I say that. But some of my other colleagues might just call it stranger-directed aggression or owner-directed aggression or dog-directed aggression. So again, there's
Categorize
not
it more in the focus
by
of
the
the
target,
behavior that happens.
exactly,
Right. Yep.
exactly. And I think a lot of us are also trying to more broadly categorize some of these terms and thinking of what we call affective aggression. So that's aggression driven by an underlying emotion, and that's a negative emotional state, versus play-related aggression, which is a normal behavior of dogs. Dogs play by growling and biting and doing all sorts of things that are technically aggression.
Right.
And then there's predatory aggression, or predatory behavior, which we don't think really has an emotional component. It's dogs chase, catch, grab things, and sometimes kill things as part of their normal behavioral repertoire. Yeah.
So just for the viewers at home, that we just said aggression and then she said all that. So that's just interesting to remember. Yeah.
What's really important to take away from the complexity of aggression is that many times in genetic studies, an author or a scientist will just assign a single word as a phenotype, and because of all these complexities, you might see the title of a paper that says, motivation is linked to gene X. Now, I have no idea what they meant by motivation, but the media sees the word motivation and says, oh, they figured out what causes motivation, and it's clearly context dependent and a subset of motivation if it is in fact motivation. So, when papers come out and maybe say that aggression is linked to this gene or that gene, or this dog the breed is aggressive, I think you have to be really cautious, and you can't just take it at face value from the title of the paper. That's really important.
Yeah. Very good point.
I spent a fair amount of time thinking about how we break down parts of dog personalities and which traits might be something that there's sort of one biological process controlling the trait, partly so that when we start studying all of this lovely data that Eleanor and I have been collecting, we'll be able to connect genes to these sort of more discrete biological processes. And I've stopped thinking of aggression as a personality trait. I've started thinking of it as a tool that a dog is more or less likely to use to get what it wants. And often what it wants is to be left alone, or to have someone leave its food alone. And so then the separate thing that's really interesting is what the dog is concerned about. And so when Kelly talks about food aggression, in my mind, I break that down into the dog feels protective of its food. The dog is anxious that someone's going to take its food away for whatever reason. I mean, that may be partly because it really likes its food, and it may be partly because it's had some experiences in the past with people trying to take the food away. And then a separate question is the dog, or how likely is the dog to resort to aggression as a tool for protecting its food? And it's interesting to see that there are some dogs who are very fearful. So my dog, Jenny, almost never resorts to aggression with humans. In fact, I don't think I have ever seen her do it. She is very fearful, and she would really, really, really like strangers to leave her alone. But she, for whatever reason, doesn't have the trait of feeling that aggression is an appropriate tool for her to go to use with humans. Now, I'm pretty sure you could get her to do it, right? If you were to pin her down or something like that, I'm pretty sure that if really, really provoked, she would do it. But for whatever reason, she doesn't like to use that tool. And we had this interesting time recently. We were talking about this and looking at the answers to the questionnaires and the Darwin's dog surveys that Eleanor and I collect, and looking at how they group out into what we call factors. And so there's like a factor that has to do with how much the dogs like food and blah, blah, blah. And we found one factor that I really think I could interpret as the dog's willingness to resort to aggression as a tool. So that's how I've started thinking of aggression, not as a personality trait, but as something that the dog may or may not use as a tool. And so when you talk about these different types of it, I think of it as, here are the dog's concerns. Mm-hmm. And then separately on top of that. And so if the dog is fearful but not likely to use aggression, then we don't label them as fear aggressive. And we may even consider them not to be a problem dog, although I think we know that in fact there is a problem there. Mm-hmm. So.
And I guess all dogs have got that potential for those behaviours. Like there is no dog that we would say has no potential for aggression whatsoever, or to display behaviours that we perceive as
label as aggression.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Conceptualise as aggression. So this is where it's going to get really crunchy. What can we do in this space of behavioural genetics to advance the goal like less people injured by dogs?
That's a really hard question. I don't know would be the first answer. I think that's a really, obviously, the reason why I'm an academic researcher is so that I don't actually have to deal with the real world. That's like a real world question. But I think there is an awful lot of value in just trying to understand more what the relationship is between people and their dogs. And there's a lot of different people that have been studying that for many, many decades. But I think as came up in Jessica's question and answer session, we always want to reevaluate what it is we think we know. Mm-hmm. And so you should never say somebody said X 30 years ago and therefore it's true. Mm-hmm. And I think as we try to understand dogs and how they relate to us, especially as the world that the dogs are living in continues to change, we need to understand what the relationship is between dogs and the people that they're living with, and seeing whether we can identify stress points or things like that. We actually may be able to suggest ways that would actually help that work better.
I, on the other hand, despite the fact that I work with Eleanor, I'm the veterinarian, and so I want to start interacting with the world and trying to change the world more. And we have these conversations a lot about how she and I will work together to find things, and then perhaps I will go off and do more sort of interactive stuff. And so one of the things that I feel strongly is that we can do better about, we know that genetics isn't all of it when we have dogs with behavioral issues, but we also know that it can be part of it. And I think that we could do better as a community at just being more careful about breeding dogs who have fear or aggression issues, right? And so we don't know how much of that is genetic, but we know that because we don't know, it could be. And also, I talked so much about maternal effects, and so mothers with these issues can pass that on to their offspring, even if it's not genetic. So I feel like really having this understanding. On Facebook a few months ago, I saw someone posting saying, I'm going to have my dog neutered because he's so aggressive to other dogs, but I'm going to collect his sperm first because he's such a great dog, so I can mate him later. And I was like, oh, no, don't. So I think this understanding that It can be genetic, and we really need not to breed some of those dogs, and that we need to really think carefully about what kinds of dogs we're breeding. And it's of course such a complicated question, and there are so many other things that we breed dogs for. But I feel like that needs to be a really important part of that conversation.
Can I ask you for clarification on one point? When you say we shouldn't breed aggressive dogs, I know what you mean. You're talking about individuals because dogs are individuals, but some people believe some breeds are aggressive. Could you just clarify a bit?
Yeah, so I'm talking about if you have a dog with behavior issues who makes the dog difficult to live with, that would not be a dog that I would breed, no matter what the breed.
Thank you.
And I don't have, I guess, so much to say in terms of the or just knock over my water bottle. Sorry about that, folks. So I don't have so much to say in terms of the behavioral genetics point, but I think some of the things that we can think about are also educating people about things as simple as canine communication and body language, because in the end, I mean, using levels of aggression such as snapping and biting are really a last resort for a lot of animals. I mean, it's maladaptive to escalate to that level because if you start a fight, you could very well get injured. So dogs being social creatures, they've evolved all of these signals to tell another individual when they're feeling threatened and when they need space, and they usually are really great at communicating that and getting that point across, and it's when we miss those signals that we end up pushing these dogs to these higher level intensity behaviors. So I feel like that is actually one of the things that I first start with is start talking about people about body language so they can recognize the lower level signals and address it from there. And I feel like if we did a better job of getting this information out to children in schools and getting it out to parents and just people who love dogs and want to interact with dogs, then we could go a long way. I know I had a client who recently told me that after we had a consult and we talked a lot about dog behavior, she stopped rushing up to every dog that she met on a walk because she started realizing, you know what?
They don't like it.
That's great.
I also had a friend on Facebook who was a father of a probably 1 or 2 year old child at the time, I think. And I had been extolling the importance of teaching children about canine body language. And he said, why would I teach my child such an esoteric thing? What's the point? And I think he was thinking, well, we don't have dogs. And so even for people who don't love dogs, you're gonna interact with dogs. They are everywhere. They are on the streets. You're gonna run into one. Your child's gonna run into one. And so even if you don't own one in your own home, I think, and there's some great resources online.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that you two have absolutely no idea how to find them and share them with people.
That Twitter is so confusing.
Julie is terrible at the Twitter. But there's some great resources online for teaching your kids about some basic dog body language and some basic politeness, like always asking someone for their permission.
And waiting for the answer.
And waiting for the answer. I had some kids, one time I was walking my dog, and he was younger, and he had been recently traumatized by a pair of identical twin girls who walked towards him saying, "Can we touch your dog?" simultaneously, and he was like, "Oh God," and he was just sort of at that age where it was tough. So I was walking him, and a bunch of kids called out to me, "Can we come pet your dog?" And I was just thinking, now is not the time for it, and I don't have enough treats on me for this, and it's not well controlled. So I said no, and I said, "He's really scared of you." And first of all, I could see just almost the shock on their face that I said no, because I don't think anyone had said no to them before. But they hung back, and then when I said, "He's really scared of you," they started laughing. So I felt like that was a really good interaction, that they learned something, and they behaved very appropriately. But I could see that it was really a new situation for them for not being told yes.
And it's I know with dog behavior experts, very often you'll look at a dog and there's like this snapshot that you're getting of why I would or wouldn't interact with that dog. And so instead of putting your love of dogs onto that dog to say, does that dog want to interact with me, is a really interesting thing that you have to do in your job.
So hard for so many of us to remember that the dog has this perspective, and that just because we want to touch the dog doesn't mean that the dog wants to touch us.
Right.
Yeah, we're very primate, aren't we? We're very but we're very primate. We're all very tactile, touchy. We want to groom you. We want to touch you, and Dogs don't operate that way.
And just to tie onto that too, it's really interesting because one of the recommendations that we often give to veterinarians, if they're trying to reduce fear of the veterinary clinic in the animals that they're seeing, is we ask them, just walk in the room and just wait for like 1 or 2 minutes before you start touching the animal. And it's amazing how that one piece of advice really can decrease the fear in these dogs that are in a stressful situation.
That's a great example.
And give them treats.
Yes, of course.
Okay, yeah. Or do we have this one from this one? We're just going to discuss for a moment.
Yeah, one moment.
Yeah.
We're just,
I was going
So
to.
we'll just
Yeah,
repeat the
just
mantra,
come
all dogs are individuals a few times.
Yeah, right. It's the new mantra.
we're just working out how else to trick you into
yeah.
the big reveals.
So it seems like we have these ideas about socialization, that there might be this ideal, although there's a lot that could go into it, versus the less ideal socialization. So I guess if you are a person that is seeking out a younger dog and you want them to have a more ideal situation, what is something that they should be looking for when either purchasing or acquiring a puppy? In terms of, you see what I'm saying, that they...
You mean what situation do you want the puppy to have had?
Correct.
Yeah.
Or it doesn't have to be exact, but what are things that people should be thinking about in terms of, because we've been talking about this construct of socialization, but what are actual things that we want to see?
I mean, so I gave some specifics at the end of my talk, but I would say have a conversation with whoever's been taking care of the dog before you, right? I mean, you have all this information because you watched all of SPARCS, and so you're an expert now. But sit down with that person and be that the breeder, or if it's coming from the shelter, try to figure out who at the shelter knows the dog. So it may not be the adoption coordinator that you talk to. There may be some staff member, but I think at a lot of shelters, if you say, who really likes this dog? Who knows this dog? Is there someone who considers this dog their favorite? Can I talk to them? If they're not working now, perhaps I could come back and talk to them later. And then I think from what we've been talking about these last 2 days, you can hopefully have some idea of some of the questions to ask about what environment the dog's been in.
And I would just follow that up with, again, socialization is a construct, right? And it means different things to different people. And it's it's really important to be careful about what we're talking about. I see a lot of dogs that are exposed to a lot of different environments for the purposes of socialization, but they are adult dogs. Often they are really fearful dogs. And what in fact is happening is what we call flooding, which means the animal is exposed to something that it's really scared of, doesn't have the opportunity to get away from that thing that they're scared of, and then their fear gets worse. So if you have an adult dog and you're interested in helping to treat that underlying fear, it's really important that that exposure is controlled and it's at the level that the dog can handle. And that's honestly true for puppy socialization too. As Jessica so nicely stated earlier, you gotta expose the puppy at the level that they're comfortable with and pay attention to how they're responding to the situation and not just take a blanket approach and say, oh, I gotta take my puppy, they have to meet 100 people in the next 2 weeks for me to do a good job with socialization.
And we really care about their sensory system and thinking about what is important to a dog and all those jolly good things.
Absolutely.
And some, sorry.
I'm sorry. I think also I would say that a lot of people feel like they can do it on their own, and they may have a lot of knowledge, but there's a big benefit to doing it with other people. And so try to find a puppy class to take your puppy to. Certainly one of the benefits there is the socialization time with other puppies, but there's also just having the access to a trainer who knows what they're doing, make sure that they do know what they're doing. But being able to talk to the trainer, even not necessarily about what's going on in the class, but just, oh, I just can't deal with this thing that this puppy is doing. Can you give me some advice? Having access to a trainer for those kinds of things is really useful. And again, I mean, there's online communities that can be good ones. And so when we're talking about this Dog Sports Academy that I'm working for, and there's some great puppy socialization classes there too, so that you can have people to talk to. So don't go it on your own.
Someone's asked on the Twitter, so just sort of saying we're encouraged to rescue dogs from shelters and rescue organisations, which gives us no control over looking for good breeder or participating in early socialisation. So how do we choose and give rescue dogs the best shot at a good life, both for them and for us? So I know that's straying a little bit away from the behavioural genetics, but given we've got you here, would you like to comment on that? And I guess what you're saying, you can take an adult dog to training classes. It still gives you dedicated one-on-one time with your dog, which sometimes is the hardest thing
So
if you're coming from a
important,
family
yeah. So
environment
important.
to just have time to focus on each other. You can still do a lot of these things that we're talking about, even if it's at
And
an
to
older
have the
age.
structure that helps you build that bond.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, again, it's pay attention to what the dog is telling you, how they're reacting to certain situations, and modifying your approach based on that. And then going back to some of the things I talked about earlier, like the first thing that you should do is really check and make sure that their health is appropriate and that they don't have any concerning medical conditions. The second part is controlling the environment. And I really love Dr. Susan Friedman's work on this, and she really focuses on control the environment, not the animal, and that's the first place to start. And then from there, it's teaching the animals what behaviors you want it to do, using positive reinforcement, so it figures out how to be effective in its environment.
Kind of leading off a little bit of this, given everything that we've been talking about early experiences and maternal environment and genetics, maybe wouldn't it be better to get an adult dog?
I recommend that to a lot of people.
So better to get an adult dog. And also, what is an adult dog? What am I talking about?
Right. Well, so, I mean, certainly by the time they're sort of 3 or 4 years old, you can feel moderately confident. Some dogs, we say, have an extended childhood, and it may be more like 4 or 5 years. But by around there, you have an adult dog. There's, of course, that influx of dogs to shelters around the 1 year of age when they're becoming super obnoxious. But
Labels,
endless
labels.
Super obnoxious.
when they're high energy.
People have adolescents too.
People maybe haven't put the effort into training them that they might have. But as they get older, you'll know more and more about them. And so you'll have more of an idea of what the final personality is going to be around a year of age. But certainly you have much more of an idea at 3 years of age. And I think for people who really want a guarantee of the kind of dog that they're going to have, where they really have a very specific need for a kind of dog to slot into their home, it's very important that the dog meets specific needs. I would almost always, for those people, recommend an adult dog because you really know what you're going to get. With puppies, you can work very hard and, find just the right breeder and raise the puppy just right, but there's just so many unknowns when you get something so little.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. I think you stated that beautifully.
Sorry, I said everything you were
No,
saying.
that was perfect.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, Chris, I'm going to hit you with this one and then we'll migrate around the group. We're obviously doing a dog conference with the main theme of behavioural genetics because it's an important topic. But do you think in some ways it's a dangerous topic? Do you think it's an area where the general public can go majorly adrift in regards to their understanding and perception of it? And are there any major challenges that we have even when we're just discussing behavioural genetics?
Not if they listen carefully to what we said, but if they just heard the title of the topic and then decided to go run with it, I think there's a problem. Genetics started with Mendel for me, and that was right around the end of the Civil War. And that's I'm going to give credit to Don. Don told me that Mendel's P's are probably what most people know about genetics. And I don't think in any other topic or any other discipline do people in the 21st century use Civil War understanding of science to explain anything except for dogs.
Oh man, it's so true. And actually, there's this fascinating paper out there. It's I'll get you guys the reference, written by Rosie Redfield, talking about how we should redesign genetics courses. And she says basically we traditionally start by teaching people about Mendel, and our understanding is so different, and Mendel is so oversimplified these days that then there's just no coming back from it. And so they start, so you start with these undergraduates in college teaching them about Mendel, and you're like, okay, and now now we know all these other things, but their perception, just the way they're formulating it in their heads,
impression was
it's
still
just,
Mendo.
you can't get past it. And so she has this great paper where she talks about, well, why don't we approach it entirely differently and like do Mendel last if we even talk about him directly at all, but talk about. And so the IABC course we were talking about, I tried to do that. I tried to structure it much more like, well, let's start out with DNA and how DNA works, and then sort of from there, with these building blocks, come up to understanding behavioral genetics better. It was a fabulous course. It was amazing. People really didn't really want to learn about DNA so much, though. They really wanted to learn about the behavior stuff. And that's something else we were talking, was it at dinner? I feel like we were talking about this recently, where we were saying that the behavioral genetics in the end is really complicated, and it's really lovely that we have this opportunity to talk to people in such detail about it. But even so, in my talks, I'd start talking about epigenetics, and I'd think like, oh, it would be really nice if I could drill down and explain all these exact mechanisms to people, because I think they'd understand a lot better, and I think it would really enrich their understanding of the final concept. But no one wants to listen to me start explaining about how the methyl group attaches to this exact point, and then that affects how the transcription factor, Oh, sorry, because I could keep going for a while.
Let me just add one thing, and this is, I think, really the most important point. A main theme in our conference has been that genetics is not predestination, as you put it.
Yeah.
It's really important to understand for the adaptive value of alleles to contribute in behavior, to contribute to successful progeny from parents, there has to be behavioral plasticity. If there is no ability to have a change in behavior, given that you have a certain genotype on certain genes, then as soon as the environment or the condition changed, the animal would no longer survive. So when I think of behavioral genetics, I literally think of a huge normal distribution, and I'm like, even with specific alleles, because genes plus environment equals phenotype, you can still get a tremendous amount of plasticity. I mean, you could take the most resilient person or organism you can find, and I'm sure you could do something to make it feel not so good. And you can take some animal that is very fearful, and you can get it to be comfortable in very busy, high noise environments. So one more thing I'll say just to bring it home, even if someone said that there was an allele that, I don't believe this, but if someone said there was an allele that made dogs more likely to kill humans, let's just say that, and that there was a dog that was homozygous or heterozygous for this allele, we know that some alleles can be silenced. So if that allele were silenced, even though they would test for it in a genetic test, that gene may never be on in that dog. And we have enhancer and suppressor mutations, which we've known about for a very long time in developmental biology. And when people first started learning about genetics, they're like, oh, this gene does that. And then, you hear during the talk people say they do it in different genetic backgrounds because there's genes that can overcome or contribute to pushes and pulls in different directions. And that's why we say it's complex, because you have 25,000 genes or 20,000 genes, and you have 2 copies of each, and you may have hundreds or thousands of alleles of some genes. Haplotypes are even more combinatorially crazy. There's like no way to just point and say that region of the genome is why that dog did that thing. I mean, I strongly believe that.
I think if I were going to add something to this, I would just say that one of the things we struggle with, because I also work in human genetics, is that we have a very long history of misusing genetic science to make determinations that are not good. And one of the things I like talking about dog genetics is it's a way to talk about genetics that actually removes us from a lot of this baggage that human genetics carries along with it. But I think I have a lot of the same concerns. I think genetics is an incredibly powerful tool that is going to be amazing once we can understand how it's influencing behavior and everything else, but we have to remember that it's only part of the story, and always question what genetics is telling you. And if the story seems too easy and too simple to be true, it's too tidy, there's probably something wrong there, because it's just a really complicated picture, and you just have to be really careful about how you think about it.
Yeah. That's a great summary. Well, one of the questions that we had on Twitter was, what is your main takeaway? What do you want people to leave this conference with? And you can't all have the same one, but you might. And if you can do it in 5 words or less, you get a gold star. imaginary.
Do you have gold stars?
I do not.
Julie.
I'm just,
It's a construct.
it's a construct in your mind.
Genes plus environment equals phenotype.
Well, I was going to say genes and environment interact, so that's pretty much the same thing.
Well, yours is genetics. Is
Genetics and environment
predisposition.
interact.
Or
Genetics is not predestination.
That's
Great.
fine.
All right. Done.
You're
Thank you.
welcome. Your words.
Then mine would be don't judge a dog by its appearance.
Lovely.
You don't get a gold star.
I know. A fake gold star.
Don't
You
judge,
get one.
don't judge dogs
No,
by
7.
appearance.
Yeah.
Thank
you. Panel.
And I was just going to, I came up with, we need more data.
Excellent. Very nice.
We have just had one last little question come through on Twitter for you, Jessica, just asking, could you tell us a little bit more about spatial learning in utero? Because they're not sure if they got that right.
Yeah, I didn't. So I didn't talk about that so much. It's something that people know more familiar with the psychology literature are more familiar with. I don't suppose it's something. No, Kelly. Kelly does more psychology reading than I do. So it's actually there aren't a whole lot of differences that we perceive between biological men and biological women in terms of cognition, but one of them seems to be that biological men are a bit better at sort of spatial perceptions. And so it's, Eleanor is giving me the side
But
eye.
you're wrong about that.
So again, this is not my area of expertise. So this is something that I learned in a course that I took during my PhD program. So we can blame the person who taught me that. But anyways, whether it's correct or not, it's this idea that sort of spatial perceptions. So how far is it to there, or can I think of an object and then rotate it in my head to imagine what it would look like rotated. For me compared to my husband, so an N of 2, but when we move to a new place, which we've done quite a bit because I'm an academic, he learns his way around the new city much, much faster than I do. And so he quickly gets to this place where he can say like, oh, well, north is that way. And in order to get to this place, you would take this street. Well, I'm still on the level of like following the GPS. Now, obviously there's a massive amount of individual variation there. But there are studies, whether Eleanor agrees with them or not, and whether other people agree with them or not, suggesting that that is a difference between males and females. And that seems to be a difference that is in rats. When rats are more masculinized, they seem to be better at that kind of visual spatial learning.
In utero, though?
When they are masculinized in utero,
Right.
after they come out of the uterus,
Oh, the maze is not in the uterus?
I mean, I think it's a pretty straightforward path to get out.
Touche.
Go down.
Well, that's an area where you see a little
Yeah,
doorway in.
it's interesting because one of the problems with studying any gender differences in people is that we cannot distinguish what may or may not be biological from all of the expectations that societally we
For
put
sure.
on
Gender stereotype
on girls
development.
versus boys.
Yeah, right.
And it, in some ways, is similar to what we do with dogs, where we say if you're breed X, then you're going to be Y.
I was thinking it earlier.
Yeah,
Because, it's something I'm very careful with in raising my 2 daughters is trying to reduce the number of gender stereotypes that they're exposed to. And I was thinking there's so many similarities.
Yeah, it's like how
with
often has
breed
it just the
stereotypes.
expectation
Yeah.
been that the girl can't read the map, so they just don't give it to her. It's like it's really interesting once you start catching yourself. And so humans happen to be a species that has remarkably little difference between the genders compared to many other species. Compared to, I'm not going to come up with exact examples, but I'm sure the vet could come up with species where there's major size differences and things like that. But
Or
one of the
birds where the
yeah.
males sing the song and the females don't sing.
So it's hard to know how you would actually use other species to study what would happen in humans versus other things. But one of the interesting things with something like dogs is that at least they're not taking on board our expectations for how they're supposed to behave quite the same way our children do necessarily.
Are you sure that the owners aren't treating the male dogs differently than the female dogs?
I have no idea.
I think it's possibly the case.
I think male dogs are disproportionately neutered.
Actually, the term neutered can be.
I know that was a joke.
So yeah,
Scientifically
and I
inaccurate
can,
joke. It was
Anyways, I can try to help you. You guys can maybe find references on your own, but if you'd like, I can. There's a particular paper that I read through when I was prepping for this talk, and I don't remember if it actually talked about this or if it just sort of said, here's the summary and pointed out to some references, but I can certainly help finding some.
With the hashtag SPARCS18, and the person who was interested can then follow up and read it, and that would be great.
Sure.
We've reached, sadly, the time in the event where it's time for us to start closing this puppy down.
It's been a very good puppy.
We do really want to make sure that we thank everyone who's been watching and tuning in from all around the world. This event would not be the same without your participation.
Correct.
So
Thank
thank you. We want to say a really large thank you to Mike, John and Andy of Thinkertron, who have been responsible for the video, audio and recording, getting us through our technical glitches that we've had.
Not caused by me.
Julie totally never turned the internet off.
Didn't do it.
We're really grateful that Sparks has been taken on by the National Canine Research Council, who have made this event and the recordings from all the previous years' content freely available on the website at sparksinitiative.org. And if you'd like to show your appreciation by making a donation, you can do so at animalfarmfoundation.org/donate. And with that,
Before we sign off, Kelly, could you hand me the bottle of oxytocin, please? Just pick it up so they can see it.
Oh my gosh.
You guys have a great night.
thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.